If you're getting into the rich sounding jazz chords and you want to add some more life and some more color to the way that you play chords, then starting to work with rootless chord voicings is a great option. Once you start playing rootless jazz chord voicings, you get a lot more options when it comes to your comping, your chord melody arrangements, or your chord solos. And it's also a great way to start moving away from just thinking in static grips with chords and really more in harmony and chords that flow from one to another. And it's actually pretty easy to get into. My name is Jens Larsen, learn jazz, make music. Let me show you how this works. It's really, really simple. You probably already know these chords. And making these voicings into rootless voicings is really just leaving out the lowest note that we're playing. So in this case, that's the D, the G, and the C, because that's of course the root. Then we have this. Now you're probably wondering, what's the big deal? They're pretty much the same and they're just a little bit easier to play. Why are you making a fuss about this? But actually it's solving quite a few problems and it's also opening up for some really great things, and that's the next thing I'm going to talk about. There are two main advantages to using rootless voicings. The first one is that if you're playing in a band, then you kind of want to stay out of the frequency area or the range of the bass player. So if you keep playing voicings where you have these low notes happening all the time, then you're actually getting in the way of the bass player and you're clashing with the bass line sometimes. So it's better for the bass player and of course also better for you if you don't have those clashes. The other thing is that now that you're not playing the root, then you have a lot more freedom to improvise. You can play other things, you can start moving around notes in the chord, change the melody, and this opens up for a lot of beautiful things that you can start working with. That's what I'm going to talk about in the rest of this video. And we're really starting with things that you already have in your fingers, things that you already know what sounds like. You already have them in your ears. In this example, I'm changing the top note of the chord, so I'm getting a different melody and I'm just using other notes from the scale. I think the only note that really needs a little bit of explanation is on the G7, where we have the G7 with the A, so the ninth in the melody, moving to the A flat, the flat 9, and then down to the C major. Now one way of looking at that is, of course, that it's moving from a G7 to a G7 with a flat 9 to a C major 7, so we kind of have this alteration on the G7. But you can also just think about this in a more melodic way, because now we are working more with voices. And really what's happening here is just we have a chromatic leading note that's creating some tension and then we're resolving it on the next chord. And this can be a really useful way to think about alterations as chromatic leading notes that need to resolve in the next chord. In the next example, we're going to take this a lot further, where I'm also going to start to add more color by simply adding more notes and another string. Here I'm starting with the basic voicing that we ended up with, so this rootless version of the D minor, but then I start adding strings and that means I can add a 9 on top of it and a D. In fact, I'm getting drop 2 voicings out of this, but I'm just thinking it from this basic shape that we ended up with by playing a rootless version of this one. And the same happens on the G7 here, and then going to this, which is again a G7 flat 9. Now it's really just with a 5th on top, resolving to this C major 7, and again you just want to see that the melody is added on top of the basic voicings that we already had. Until now I've focused on moving around the melody and just adding some variation and color with that. Of course you can also start working with moving around the other voices that we're playing in the chords, and that's going to open up a lot more stuff as well, and that's what we're going to do next. Just to get used to that part of the process, let's just take another set of voicings. So you probably already know these chords. And we can turn those into rootless voicings like this. A basic variation on these voicings could be something like this. What you want to notice here is that again I'm using the E flat, so the flat 13 on the dominant, as a chromatic leading note. So I'm really just going from the 13 to the flat 13 and then resolving that down to the 9th on the C major 7. Another thing that you should notice is that, in fact, I'm playing this as if there are two layers. So I'm playing the melody part and I'm sustaining the chords all the time. So the melody moves while the chords stay ringing, and the same goes for the next chord. So in that way, I'm really starting to work with something that's more polyphonic and really using the different layers within the chords. And we can expand on this and then turn that into 4-note chords as well and get a lot more options like this. And in this example, the perfect fifth of the dominant almost becomes a chromatic leading note because I'm transitioning from E flat, the flat 13, down to the perfect fifth and then ending on the flat 5. Adding the flat 9 here on top and then resolving to this C major 7. That's really just this voicing, but then with the added fifth on top. And if you start working with moving around some of the lower voices in the chords, then you get a lot of options, and also some chords that are kind of hard to explain if you're just looking at them as vertical chords instead of understanding the whole movement of the voices and the harmony. So an example of that could sound something like this. The main character here is probably this, where I have a leading note on the D minor 7, and I'm really just playing in the middle voice here this chromatic encircling of the third on the G7. So the melody is really using this A sharp to lead to the next chord. And really, if you look at this chord sort of in a vertical way, what's happening on beat 4 would be this, which is kind of like a B flat power chord. And of course, a B flat power chord is not really something you associate with a D minor 7. But in this case, it works because it's just a part of a movement to the G7. And the same happens on the C major 7, where I'm moving the 7th down to the 6th. But I'm doing that with chromaticism. And I'm not really, in the middle here, we have a C7 with a 9, but of course the chord here is not a C7. That's just a part of the voices moving. As you can probably tell from this, you can get into a lot of very deep things with harmony, and also just some really great colors and options if you start working with these rootless voicings. And if you want to take rootless voicings further and maybe not start with just the basic chords that you already know, then a great place to start is to start working with triads. And in this video, I'm talking about how to use triad voicings on Take the A Train. That's a very practical way to approach this, and it's really going to give you a lot of options for how you can start working with these triad voicings and rootless voicings in general.